Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming back. And this is the second in a series. These lectures, for those of you who weren't here the first time, they're trying to build up in the end toward an account of action and indeed moral action as well. And I wanted to mention again that they're dedicated to Derek Parfit. And I wish I had something better to offer him, but I think he'll understand. Okay, well, there's some big issues. We always want to keep the big issues in view. There are these large questions in normative and metanormative theory that really hang on the nature of belief and desire, much as that might seem odd. They're just these psychological states, but what they are, whether they have a potential to rationalize action, in what sense they could be a ground for reasons for action, in what sense they could be a ground for some kind of knowledge or understanding. On this turns questions about the possibility of truth or knowledge in ethics or practical reason, cognitivism versus non-cognitivism, the potential scope of practical reason. Are all of our reasons limited, as Williams argued, by our subjective motivational set? About the nature of agency and free will. Frankfurt, Watson, and others have explored the idea that you can look to the motivational system to try to understand the nature of agency and free will. Higher order desires, for example. The nature of well-being. Many of the strongest contenders as theories of well-being are desire-based theories. If desires have no rationalizing power, it's a problem for such theories. And finally, and I think this is important, there are many places in the theory of practical reason and in theoretical reasoning where we'd better hope that we can give an understanding of beliefs and desires in such a way as to avoid problems of regress. That is, they can constitute non-deliberative dispositions that are somehow sufficiently intelligent to enable us to be rational, even though we are making acts or dispositions, transitions in thought that are non-deliberative. Okay, so here's the standard model of intentional action. I've been calling it. People like very much to beat up on this model, and it's certainly overly simple. My aim, at least initially, is to take this model seriously and to ask whether we can, by deepening what we think about belief and desire, get a better account of how they might indeed be able to combine to explain and rationalize action. And so last time it was about desire. I was trying to convince you of a view that probably none of you found terribly plausible about desire, namely we can be rational in desire. And today I'm going to try to convince you of a view about belief that probably is going to be harder to swallow. So I take the problem seriously. So here's a standard picture of how you'd apply this model in something like practical reasoning. I guess this is Aristotle's example. I desire that I have a cloak on Tuesday. I believe I will only have a cloak on Tuesday if I purchase one today. And therefore, I set in motion the action of purchasing one today. The end of a practical deliberation is the beginning of action, and the beginning is desire or motivation, we're told. So that would be an example of practical reasoning. But you might say, how do those actually come together, the belief and the desire, in such a way as to create the beginnings of action? Action is a highly organized phenomenon. Belief and desire seem like atomic psychological states. How can they come together and do something as complicated as organize intentional action? Action that is done for a reason, is done with an end in view. So that's the question. And we mentioned this briefly last time. A standard response recently has been to say, you've got to bring the agent in, that what's missing from the belief, desire, action is the behavior of the agent. It's the agent's involvement. So Christine Korsgaard wrote, to will an end is not just to cause it or even to allow an impulse in me to operate as its cause, but, so to speak, to consciously pick up the reins and make myself the cause of the end. So here's the agent coming in to this process of belief and desire formation, picking up the reins and steering it in a certain direction. David Velleman writes, the agent's interactions with his mental states are such that they couldn't have with themselves. His role is to intervene between reasons and intention, between intention and bodily movements, and to oversee this process of action. And John Searle similarly argues that we have to bring the agent in, and he locates a series of gaps in the belief-desire model. The agent, he thinks, must come in to deliberate and bring deliberation to a conclusion, must form a prior intention, must decide when to act, make it an intention in action, as he calls it. And because actions typically extend over time, the agent has to be continuously active so as to have the intention in action actually govern the behavior. And so the agent's doing a lot of intervening here, many times over. And the problem with these pictures, attractive as they are, is that they're invoking an agent taking an action or a series of actions that are supposed to be done for a reason in order to explain what it is for an agent to act for a reason. That is to say, we're invoking exactly the notion that we're trying to explain. And what we would want to know right away is those actions, picking up the reins, intervening among your mental states, forming an intention and following it through. Those actions presumably are done for reasons. Does that mean that there is, for each of them, an agent filling in the gaps, for each of them, someone taking up the reins? It would seem we need to have sort of a first-order account if we're ever going to get agency off the ground. This is not meant to be a problem just for the most sophisticated agency, but even for elementary agency, to get it up off the ground, we need some account, some non-agential account of how the structure that's requisite for intentional agency, a structure that brings together what we care about and what we think about the world, brings those together to organize possible actions and dispose us to perform them, so that the agent can, for example, by seeing some new fact, having some new thought, meeting a person or something like that, act intentionally without requiring or deciding upon an intention to do so, since that would require deciding to have an intention, which would require deciding to have an intention, and so on. So at some level, we have to bottom out in this non-agential account. Now, acting intentionally, and even if I do consciously form an intention then, requires this kind of a story. It's not just a story that I require, it's a story required on all the stories, so that I can do something like deliberation fluently in real time in such a way as to be responsive to reasons without getting in my own way. The agent coming in got into her or his own way. And we also can't appeal to some kind of pre-packaged fixed action patterns or habits to do this. If picking up the reins were just a mechanical act that was hit by some stimulus from the environment, then that wouldn't make the action seemingly rational. It wouldn't make it seem even like agency. Agency is a flexible, active, fluent activity, and we couldn't possibly do the sort of things we do using just a set of fixed habits. I mean, think of the sentences that you utter in the course of a fluent conversation with someone. To imagine that those could be the product of some habit would be very hard to even more hard to believe than the view I'm going to defend, perhaps. Okay, so here's an alternative, and this comes from Stalnecker's functionalist approach. A belief and desire, he says, are correlative dispositional states of a potentially rational agent. And he gives us this very elegant interlocking characterization. To desire that P is to be disposed to act in ways that would tend to bring it about that P in a world in which one's beliefs, whatever they are, were true. And to believe that P is to be disposed to act in ways that would tend to satisfy one's desires, whatever they are, in a world in which P, together with one's beliefs, were true. Now, an interesting feature of this is it makes it evident how pivotal a role desire is playing in this process. If you're a potentially rational agent and desire is playing this pivotal role, that's why we had to go through all that stuff last time about maybe being rational in desire. But now I want to focus on the belief part and how beliefs and desires could come together. And what Stalnecker is suggesting is beliefs and desires are already organized dispositions. They're already representationally mediated structures that can yield action tendencies, so the agent doesn't have to come in and plug them together in order to get the action tendencies that then the agent could, in the spur of the moment or in full deliberation, bring into play. And so to give this characterization of desire, I know there's some people who weren't here last time. I dragged you down into the metro in Paris and argued that this turned out to be a theater of desire because arching over my head were these grand images of another world, beautiful people, beautiful objects, pulling me, alluring to me, and that they were actually trying to plant in my head the very kind of representation of something that would be what it would be like to, via a representation, desire the thing. And so I started drawing these kinds of diagrams. So here I am, I'm on the platform, there's this attractive representation. Via that representation, I see the object in view, I have the object in prospect now. That favorable representation regulates in me a focused motivation to pursue the object. And so if the advertisement works, then I'm going to be motivated to get a cup of coffee. Even if I wasn't antecedently interested in one, I now will have some more disposition to choose it because the desire has been, so to speak, implanted or grafted into me. Now, fortunately, it doesn't always work. right? There's some advertisers who don't succeed. This was an ad campaign for the Renault R14, which was thought to be a beautiful breakthrough because it was pear-shaped. And this was the image, the alluring image that you were supposed to have of your family traveling in this Renault R14. Well, the model was not terribly successful, as you can imagine. But there's a more important way in which the advertisers can fail, which is that after you buy your Renault R14 and you have expectations of how it's going to perform based upon this wonderful advertising campaign, it can fail to live up to those expectations. And as a result, you can lose your degree of liking for the idea of having a Renault R14 and maybe search around for ways to get rid of it or replace it with something more acceptable. And so in that sense, desire has this kind of a structure of experimentation, comparison, and potential feedback and updating of the ways in which you approach the world through your affective attitudes. So this is a causal process. You could look at it and say, look, Railton, you've just given us a causal process. Yes, merely causal in some sense, but not merely causal. It involves an affective attitude, which sustains evaluative expectations about the world. They could be simple, like the pleasure of a cup of coffee. They could be complicated, like the desires that get people to go join utopian communities, which then collapse because they don't live up to the expectations people have. It elicits and regulates focused motivation governed by the image on behalf of realizing those evaluative expectations. That sounds like a sense-making behavior on the part of an agent. So it organizes an available action tendency under an idea, makes the behavior intelligible as a response to an apparent reason, an apparent good, as Aristotle would have it. It shows how the idea can be held in view to monitor the behavior and outcomes. It doesn't require the agent constantly intervening to pay attention to what's going on. And as I argued, it can have a mind-to-world and not just world-to-mind direction of fit. It can be more or less accurate. It can learn. It can calibrate better or worse to the kind of life, the kind of car, the kind of drink that you would actually find it rewarding to have. And so in these respects, desire that P is an intelligent, organized disposition such that I could, seeing an opportunity, having a thought, hearing another person's remarks, I could respond fluently in intelligent, intentional, reason-sensitive ways via this desire. And moreover, it's a regulative structure. So, for example, if you think of Frankfurt's account of how agency works with desire, he says it's not enough to just have first-order desires. That's not like agency. That's the wanton. It matters whether the desires that you act on are the desires which, in his original formulation, you, in some sense, value or evaluate or endorse. And that's what this picture does at the first-order level. It's a case where a representation governs motivation. It's not just pure motivation. And the representation engages some favorable, effective, evaluative attitude. Now, later, Frankfurt moved this theory in the direction of trying to make that higher-order attitude just a volition, but Watson and others have developed it in this more evaluative direction, and I think that's the most plausible way to do so. So, here's the claim I made. You should generalize your picture, if you haven't done so already, of mind-to-world fittingness. There are lots of ways your mind could fit the world. You could believe a true proposition, but there are lots of things in your mind besides propositions. There are action tendencies and desires and beliefs. And so those things aren't necessarily going to have these properties. Indeed, even belief, if it comes in degrees, is not going to have the obvious property of truth. But it can be well-directed. It can be accurate. It can be responsive to evidence. It can be proportional in its strength. It can represent an appreciation of a situation, an understanding of possibilities. Those are all ways that you can have mind-to-world direction of fit. And the claim was desire can have these ways, and that in that sense, desire is part of our appreciative representation of the reasons of the world. But that doesn't require that the desire be a judgment, which is a judgment of desirability. We got this not by making it a judgment at all, but by making it a regulated action tendency in which evaluation and an evaluative attitude is at the center. Okay, so on to belief. Desire can't act alone. We also need a representation of the world's relevant possibilities for action. As Stalnaker said, to believe that P is to be disposed to act in ways that would tend to satisfy one's desires, whatever they are, in a world in which P, together with one's other beliefs, were true. And so, like desire, belief now looks like it's going to be an intelligent disposition. It's capable of organizing behavior under an idea, the idea provided by the desire under which you're acting. and providing guidance for that. It doesn't just say that you're going to act in a way that's pushed by your desire. It's a way that is going to satisfy your desire. That is to say, it's going to be regulated by whether or not the desire is satisfied together with one's other beliefs. So what kind of a structure might it be that would do that? Again, very bloody-minded person that I am. I tend to follow Richard Feynman in these matters. What I can't build, I don't understand. And so our method here today is the same as last time. We're going to assemble some field notes about how, in last case, it was desire. In this case, belief seems to operate, how people speak of it when they think of it as rational or irrational, and so on. We'll take these notes, combine them with various truism, paradigm cases, causal roles, explanatory desiderata, and so on, to get something like a job description for an account of desire or belief, in this case, to fill. And then we're going to ask how we could build a state or a process from simpler ingredients, ones that we understand antecedently, that could satisfy the job description, at least to a reasonably high degree, and which then might enable us to make sense of how that state could have this capacity to enable us to be aptly responsive to reasons. Well, what are some obvious features of belief? Nothing is more obvious, it seems, than that belief has a representational character. It presents the world to us through some form of representation, and that representation mediates the way in which the role influences all the rest of our psychic economy. Lois Lane famously will not be surprised to see bullets bounce off Superman, but she will if they bounce off Clark Kent. Well, it's the same person. Why is she surprised in the second case? Because she is seeing Clark Kent under the representation Clark Kent, who's a dweeb and certainly not bulletproof. What about truth or falsehood? That's another obvious feature of beliefs. We speak of beliefs as true or false, and we do believe propositions, among other things. And in such cases, we tend to talk of the belief as true in the case in which its content is true, because as Hume put it nicely, belief adds no new idea to the proposition. Okay, so we've got representation and truth or falsehood. Is that what we mean by saying that belief has a mind-to-world direction of fit? Well, here are some other states that have the same characteristics. Supposition that P, thought, just the thought that P, imagining that P. They also are such that they represent their content as true. They add no new content. We speak of them as true just in case their content is true. But they have a completely different role in your psychology than belief. And if you mistook your beliefs for suppositions or imaginings, you would be in very serious psychic shape. So what is it then that's going to differentiate belief from these other attitudes? Well, we're going to have a richer notion of mind-to-world direction of fit, as we noticed before. Now, there isn't, I confess, or at least I don't know, a standard account of what mind-to-world direction of fit is supposed to be or what fittingness is supposed to be. But one thing it does seem to involve is asking something like, of the case of belief or supposition or imagining, is there anything unfitting about it under certain conditions? And in the case of supposition or pretense or imagining, we can ask, is it unfitting in any way to pretend or suppose something, even while having full faith that the thing is false? The answer is no. These states, part of the work they do is enable us to think about things that we believe to be false. So there's nothing unfitting about imagining, supposing, or pretending P when you fully know P to be false. But with belief, it is certainly otherwise. Belief tends to be such that evidence, as Michael Smith put it, evidence tends to undermine belief. Believing that P in the face of what you take to be conclusive evidence that it's false seems like an unfitting state of mind to be in, if we can even make full sense of it. Assertion is presenting P as true for the taking up of others, let's say in a conversational context. If they provide you with convincing evidence that P is false, you're going to have to withdraw that assertion. That wouldn't be true of a supposition or pretense. So maybe we can understand mind-to-world fit in this richer way. Well, if we do, it's going to help, because here are some other obvious features of belief. It is spontaneously action guiding. So I'm going to use this word spontaneously a lot. I don't mean that it involves no steps. I mean that it involves no conscious deliberative steps. Belief spontaneously shapes our dispositions to act even without a gentle intervention. If I believe that this is water, I will spontaneously rely upon that belief in choosing it in order to drink rather than my cell phone, and that will immediately shape my dispositions with respect to it. In contrast, if I pretend, as I say, well, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to pretend throughout that my cell phone is the water, I'm going to have to be effortful. I'm going to have to carry out the pretense It will require agential intervention. As we all well know, we weave tangled webs indeed when we deceive. It's very hard to deceive, but it's not hard to have belief guide your ordinary actions. Related to this is the idea that beliefs come in degrees of strength. Supposition and pretense, it's not quite so clear what it means to speak of those in that way, but certainly belief, it makes good sense. We often speak of outright belief and disbelief, but we also speak of beliefs as more or less confident, and that degree of confidence tends to vary spontaneously in response to congruent or incongruent experience. So imagine me climbing out on a limb to rescue the kite of my child who's crying below, and it's a very stout limb, and I'm climbing out and feeling very proud and parental, and then I hear this sound. Now, I don't have to deliberate in order for my credence that I'm in a dangerous situation to change dramatically at that moment. It happens whether I ask it to or not. Moreover, my action tendencies change as well. They pivot on a dime. You now see me crawling timidly back the branch, no longer as interested in playing the hero, and very much concerned that I not agitate the branch too much in order to make my way back down. Well, what changed was a belief. I had a bit of evidence, I updated my belief, but this didn't require agential intervention on my part, but it had a very dramatic effect on my behavior, and it reorganized it in a systematic way. So that's a way in which degrees of belief matter, but there are two kinds of degrees of belief. You can have a high or a low expectation of an event. If you give me a coin that I'm very familiar with, I'll have an expectation of 1/2 of heads flipping it. If you give me a die, I'll have an expectation of 1/6. Don't I think the die is fair? Yes, it's fair. That means that you'll have a lower expectation value because it's got 6 sides. Okay, that's a low expectation value, but it may be a very confident belief because I know the die well, I've tossed it many times. On the other hand, you could have a high expectation value in which you were not confident. You know, a doctor says, given all of these test results, the conclusion anyone would draw is that this is the condition that you have, but something's fishy. Okay, well, that's a less confident view about a high expectation on the strength of the evidence. Okay, and they shape your behavior in different ways. Belief is also spontaneously thought guiding, and I mean thought very broadly here. What we believe spontaneously shapes what we attend to, what we happen to notice or not notice, how we interpret our experience. It shapes what recollections we form, what recollections we recall. It shapes what mental transitions we're spontaneously disposed to make and rely upon. It shapes what we expect or what we anticipate. It shapes our decision-making, as suggested, for example, in my behavior on the branch. And these effects, again, are spontaneous. They don't require agential intervention to occur, and that's critical to avoiding regress. We need belief to be an intelligent disposition that can give us things like well-confirmed conclusions on the strength of your experiential evidence without requiring that you deliberate, decide you've deliberated enough, conclude, and then set yourself to believe. You've got to do it better than that, or you'll be stuck in an endless regress. Okay. Belief is also spontaneously feeling guiding. Beliefs and changes in beliefs spontaneously affect your feelings. They certainly affected my feelings crawling out on that branch. They did that again spontaneously. They affect things like emotions, fear, anger, surprise, disappointment. You can imagine all those rushing through me as I'm out on that limb. Sentiments, resentment, guilt, embarrassment, much more complicated states. They affect our moods, our sadness, our happiness, our anxiety, and so on. I can be completely full of anxiety because I don't know where my child is. I see the child at the other end of the playground. Suddenly I'm calm, a complete change in my demeanor and my dispositions to act. Why? Because I updated a belief and I did so spontaneously. These effects can be implicit as well as conscious, and that's another reason why we can't trust the agent to put these things together, because a lot of what we believe is not conscious, and it's not consciously accessible even if we try. Sometimes we have a pretty clear sense of what we believe, but we can be deceived about that. We can call something up from what we think is our belief box and find, in fact, that we're surprised when that thing happens. Okay, well, what's going on there? I thought I believed it. I represented myself as believing it, but I didn't actually form the belief. And so sometimes we only know what we believe by noticing what unsettles us or disturbs us. And in that sense, it's quite possible to be deceived about what you believe without requiring any cunning, unconscious agent to do this to you. Belief is, however, phenomenologically thin. Typically, we act, as Smith and Pettit put it, we act with belief in the background. We act through the belief as a frame toward the content of what we believe. And belief is, in general, this I think is an important feature of belief, as it is in desire, it's a default state. If an infant did not begin with a disposition to believe his or her senses, there would be no beginning to their learning. They wouldn't even be able to learn which of their senses are unreliable and at what time. If I completely, as Hume points out, if I completely lose confidence in my faculties, it's not just that I'm in a situation that it's hard to argue my way out of. I can't argue in that situation. And so in that sense, then, by default, I have to have some degree of confidence in my capacities, my faculties, and so on. And so that means this is going to be a state that's around all the time. So it can't have a busy phenomenology. It can't be a distracting state. And it mostly calls itself to our attention when our belief changes in some sudden way, like the case where I suddenly become calm, seeing my child, or suddenly become anxious, realizing I don't know where my child is. Belief is also spontaneously projective and evidence-sensitive. We talked about evidence-sensitive first, but now I'm going to try to link these two features. Given a perception as of P, I said, we tend to immediately form a belief that P, but what happens next is we rely on that belief in action. Now, that's interesting because what I perceived was now, and my action is then, sometime in the future. So I must have believed more than P in order to have it govern my action. I have to give P some inertia. I have to project P forward, or perceiving it won't help me in guiding my action going forward. And so it's a feature of belief that it isn't conservative with respect to evidence. The most confirmed thing with respect to your evidence is your evidence. But if belief only gave you the most confirmed conclusions, given your evidence, it would be useless for belief and useless for reasoning. As Carnap pointed out in the 1950s, and his formal learning theory has amply demonstrated since, it's thanks to the fact that we have priors, that we do project our beliefs, that beliefs do have inertia. It's thanks to that, which looks a bit like dogmatism, because it's not on the strength of evidence in a certain sense. It's thanks to that we can learn, because it's thanks to that we have expectations which experience can fail to meet, and in that way learn something new rather than simply pile expectations up in some great heap of past events and have nothing to say about the question of what should happen next. Okay, wait, that's all wrong, isn't it? I mean, don't we all know that belief, in fact, shows confirmation bias, that people ignore negative evidence. They make regular elementary errors in relying on probabilities. They don't learn from experience. And the only way to correct this is via something like conscious reasoning, as Kahneman and Tversky have argued, and as many others have argued as well. Again, I have to warn you, we're departing the philosophy zone here. I'm going to be wandering off into psychology for a little while, not my area of training or expertise, so you're at great risk. But I don't see any way to respond to this criticism without wandering into philosophy. Okay, so are we really terrible at intuitive statistics? If you give people the kind of word problems that Kahneman and Tversky do, they do a poor job with them. How they do a poor job is very dependent upon how you frame the word problem itself. It depends upon the linguistic framing of the problem. You can frame it in a way that they won't make a mistake or a mistake that they will. If you give people the same kind of a task in a naturalistic setting, or give it to them as an interactive task where they can experiment, people don't make the same probabilistic errors. Human infants, for example, even in the first weeks and months of life, even while they're sitting there in their baby seat looking like, what's going on? You're thinking, what's possibly going on in the infant's head? It's actually acquiring accurate information about the probabilities of various sounds in its environment, sufficiently so that by the period of about 1 month or 2 months, it can spot anomalous versus non-anomalous sequences of phonemes in English. It will pay more attention to the anomalous ones. That's what a good learner does. They don't look for confirmation. They look for the things that they don't understand. It will devote more attention to those. It will suck on its pacifier more vigorously. Infants who observe third-person adult behavior, even in the first year of life, are adjusting their learning rate, what they will learn from adults, by observing how successful the behavior of the adults is. This is a warning to you all if you have children. They will pay attention to, for example, to the fact that you're using words and other people are correcting you, and they will pay less attention to your use of words than the ones who correct you. Infants pay attention to base rates. If you give them a clear box with yellow and blue balls in it, and you reach into the box, they're all full of blue and a couple of yellows, and you reach in the box and you pull out a yellow. Well, that's kind of interesting. If you reach in and you pull out another yellow again, the baby's very surprised. So they do pay attention to base rates. They suck away on their pacifiers. And it turns out that Bayesian models predict a large number of features of infant development of causal cognition and theory of mind. What about adults? Do we lose this? We lose a lot of capacity as we become adults in terms of learning. Do we lose this capacity to detect underlying frequencies? Well, Randy Gallistel and others have worked diligently for a long period of time, giving people these experiments where something is happening and they just vary the rate or the frequency of it at particular times, and they get individuals to make judgments about that. And if you give them this task in a way such that they're actually interactive with it, they make very accurate probabilistic assessments of the underlying frequencies. And if you take people and give them a simulated foraging task, where they've got multiple possible things, it's usually money, of course, in various forms, but multiple possible goals, multiple possible risks, multiple possible paths to follow, and you let them fool around with the situation, they will, just as our mammalian ancestors will, they'll develop optimal or nearly optimal foraging strategies in so doing, balancing off these considerations, the probabilities, the values, and so on. So humans are not terrible at intuitive statistics. And intuitive statistics work great. Word problems, we have the problem that thinking about them is hard for us to do with our limited ability and our tendency to stick with the framing of the problem and therefore be misled. How was this possible? Well, we looked at all this last time. You've got these underlying circuits that you've inherited from your handy mammalian ancestors. They got good at this, which not only record the rewards of the world, but the probabilities of the rewards in the world. They pay attention not only to the magnitude of reward, but to the relative magnitude of reward. They pay attention to the degree of risk, the frequency, and insofar as we can measure human neural responses, for example, by measuring blood oxidation levels, humans do the same thing. For a fixed reward, they show a linear increase in activity as probability goes up, and they also, in other areas, show, in their spike trains, they show a standard risk curve, which is maximal at probability 0.5. So we don't lose this as adults. And back to philosophy. But there'll be some parentheses. Okay. Any other features of belief we've left out? Well, belief is importantly relational and intentional. It can take multiple objects. We do sometimes believe propositions, often believe propositions. You could also believe your eyes. You can believe a person. You can believe in yourself. You can believe in the scientific method. And what belief can do is take belief in your eyes and shift that into belief in the experience that your eyes present, and shift that into belief in the propositions that you form on the strength of that experience. So belief can shift modality from a trusted source to a trusted outcome, and in that sense, that it's an important feature of belief that it takes multiple objects and not just propositions, because there's all kinds of stuff out in the world that we need to figure out about, and it's not just propositions sitting out there waiting for us to discover them. Belief can also relate you to objects de re or de se, as well as de dicto. We've talked about Lois Lane, for example. Intentionality directly influences your spontaneous thought, action, and feeling guidance through belief. So in the famous example of the lost camper, you've got this guy wandering around in the woods. He's late returning home. People are worried about him. They say, let's help this person out. We'll give him a map. A helicopter flies overhead, drops this map. In the map, there's this big red arrow, location of the lost camper. And so the map drops, the camper opens it up and looks at it studiously, and he says, that lost camper is really near to the stream, and he could just follow that stream to get out of the woods. Now, if only I could find the lost camper. Now, he has a true belief that the lost camper is near the stream, that the lost camper could follow the stream to get out of the woods, but he does not believe of himself that he is the lost camper. He's a typical guy. We're never lost. We're just a little bit disoriented from time to time. So what he needs to do is believe of himself that he is the lost camper, and then apply the content of the belief, not just as a true proposition, but as something that can actually translate into meaningful action on his part. Now, belief has a lot to do with action, but it's non-volitional. You can exert voluntary influence on what you pretend, on what you suppose. You can exert voluntary influence on what experiences you aim yourself toward, what people you hang out with. Do you hang around philosophers? What's your problem? What we attend to, what inferences we carry out. These will all shape what we believe, but we can't simply decide to believe or believe at will. Now, I can accept a proposition for certain purposes. I can even accept it as best supported by the evidence, and I can use it deliberatively in thinking about how to act. But that does not amount to belief or yield belief's spontaneous roles in guiding thought and feeling. So I can decide that my teenage son is old enough now. I should accept what he tells me. I shouldn't be always interrogating him. This is bad for our relationship. It's not developing trust between us. It's going to be worse. So I decide and I announce, I'm going to accept what you tell me, and you, of course, will have the responsibility of telling me what's true, because I will accept it and I will act upon it. And so he comes home one night. He has a very plausible story about where he was. That seems best supported by the evidence. I've already accepted that I'm going to accept this story. Next morning, I'm driving him and his friend to school in the car, and his friend says something which makes it perfectly clear that that story is false. Now, why am I not surprised sitting there in the front seat? Why am I thinking, yeah, right? Because even accepting with the aim of truth is not the same thing as belief. Okay. Belief is also, in that way, spontaneously resistant to instrumentalization. Nervous flyers are very familiar with all the evidence about, most of them, all the evidence that flying is much safer than driving. They're better off in an airplane than sitting in their family car. They don't, when the plane's taking off and they start to sweat and get worried and grip the handrest, they don't actually turn to the people next to them and say, why aren't you diving under the seats? We're going to crash. They don't encourage their children to drive from California rather than take a flight because they know the flight is safer. So insofar as they can, they accept and make action guiding the proposition that flying is safe. But they can't just instrumentalize belief, convenient as it would be, given that they often have to fly. To do so, they can't, on those practical grounds, get themselves to belief. So there's something about belief that is resisting this. So what's this magical power of belief that's preventing us from doing it? And notice it can't be something like just a norm of belief, because it happens even when we're not looking, even when we're being sloppy, we still have the same problem. Okay, well, I hope that's enough to convince you that belief is a pretty complicated animal, and that it has a diverse and a structured array of functions. They aren't arbitrary. They collect together in an interesting fashion. And I will, if we have time at the end, try to draw a little bit more on the popular culture of belief, but right now I need to move ahead and try to give you a model of belief to try to satisfy this description. Okay, now those of you who are here for the first lecture are hearing me repeat myself quite a bit here, because these features, the 14 features I mentioned as obvious features of belief, many of them, or very near parallels to them, were features of desire. There's a very parallel set of characteristics. We'll talk more about that as we go along. And so the thought might occur to you, it certainly occurred to me, riding in the metro back and forth, to say, well, let's try this, right? Maybe a belief is a degree of confidence in some state of affairs via a representation. What it does is it induces in me a degree of focused reliance upon that object that is represented in my action. It generates an expectation, a prediction about what will indeed arrive. That prediction, if it is met, sustains the strength of the belief. If it is not met, that will tend to undermine my confidence in the belief. I can, even though I had no antecedent belief in something, I can, by acquiring a very credible representation, one that I have high confidence in, I can, even without antecedent belief, I can come to have belief. So that model seems to give us a picture of how belief could work and how belief could have the kind of structure of a state that can regulate action. Okay, so let's talk about that a bit. We talk about belief in terms of confidence and trust. Now, those are also terms we use for affective attitudes. Affect and confidence and trust are species of affect. Might they be affect as they figure in belief? Might there be, so to speak, no accident, as people like to say, that we use these terms like confidence and trust when we're talking about belief? And might that actually help us explain these obvious features in some unified way, in the same way that the role of affect in desire helped us explain the obvious features of desire in something like a unified way? Well, what's in a name? Why call it or worry about calling it affect? Well, let me say a few words about that. Here's one of these parentheses. First of all, the neural evidence that we looked at was evidence of the affect and reward system, doing these calculations with direct projections to action-orienting behaviors. And what we're trying to find when we try to find something like belief or desire is we are trying to find a psychological kind, a state that could actually have some causal or explanatory value in thinking about action. And it would have to be a kind that we thought could have some kind of stability, a kind that we would expect to find in the mind of an intelligent creature, a kind that we could expect to have been selected for, that we have evidence for having evolved in the mammalian affective brain. So one thing to say on behalf of talking in terms of affect is that this would enable us to think of belief in a way that makes it continuous with our understanding of the way the mind works in animals as well as humans, and in a way that's consistent with the evidence that we get from neuroscience. Second, what do psychologists think affect is? Not the neuroscientists, but the psychologists. Ask them what affect is. Here's a typical psychologist model of emotion or affect. You have a set of concerns. They're sort of standing concerns. As a result, when an event occurs, you appraise it a certain way, one way or another. That has the effect of changing your action readiness, your feelingness, your arousal state, your attention, and so on. That then has a shape on your behavior. As a result of what happens in the behavior, that has a tendency to regulate your appraisal. So that has a structure that looks a lot like belief too. And so when a psychologist uses the word affect, they're looking at a system that functions something like this, typically. Remember also what we looked at last time in looking at brain boxology. So here's the boxology I got when I was a student. Stimuli come in at the top. They influence your perceptions. First thing they do is they update your beliefs with the help of capacity, with the help of concepts. Later on in the stream, they go on and affect things like emotions, moods, personality, and desires, but those are kind of off in the corner here. You can actually see, you can follow fairly direct arrows from perception to knowledge and belief and consciousness and so on to intention formation, with only a brief detour over to desire. So emotion and desire are playing a very peripheral role in that kind of a picture, and they're certainly secondary in terms of this processing of information. They are downstream from the knowledge and beliefs that we form. Well, here is a more contemporary picture. This time the perceptual stream comes up from the bottom. You have some reflexive responses, and you have the primary sensory cortices, which do some original processing. But then the first systems with which this information interacts are the systems that are involved in affect and reward. This is the system that we were looking at the electrode projections from, the striatum. This is the amygdala and orbital frontal cortex. And so what's going on is that perceptual stream is first interacting with your reward and affect system, and then the information, having been affected by those systems, goes up to something like the language cortex, and that shapes the way that you're going to interpret the experience that you're having. And so in that sense, affect has a centrality in your experience. And here is the wiring diagram we looked at from Grabenhorst and Rolls. These are individual neurons, and you can see that only a few synapses up from the perceptual input, it's already interacting with the orbital frontal cortex, with the amygdala, with the precingulate cortex. These are all affect areas. And what's going on here is that the information is passing through them and then resulting in things like higher order choice-type decision-making, explicit behavior, and so on. So on this picture, affect has got a central role in the processing of information. It's not something that comes about after you process the information. It's part of how you process it. And much of memory is also located in this system. Okay, here's a brain connectivity graph for the amygdala. It projects to virtually every area of the brain. Remember, what affect does is affect attention, perception, memory, inference, action readiness, this whole suite of behaviors, and it affects them in a coordinated way. And it can do that because it has these central features. Okay, well, why is affect so central? And an answer that contemporary psychologists often give is that evaluation is central. The affect is the system that is the fundamental currency for the brain's evaluation. And so things like risk or reward, uncertainty or certainty, benefit or harm, these are important. These are things that you have to figure out in order to act well. And so the system that represents these is a system that's going to have a primary role in the understanding and interpretation of action. And indeed, the affect cognition distinction, which philosophers are somewhat fond of, has been widely rejected in many areas of cognitive neuroscience and affective neuroscience. So we shouldn't think of affect then as this ancillary function. It's a central function, and it's central because evaluation is central to intelligent, well-organized behavior. Like other forms of affect, for example, fear, you could think about fear as a case because it's an arousal affect, so it's easier to think about. Fear can't be brought about or removed at will. If belief involves affect, like confidence or trust, that would explain why we can't have it at will, because we can't have affect at will. The system is built in such a way that you can't talk yourself out of these affective states because they're giving you much more direct and much more immediate information than your higher order beliefs about the nature of the world. And so you will find yourself in a situation where you can't talk yourself out, like the doctor couldn't talk himself out of that suspicion that there was something funny about this case. He thought he had perfectly good reason to believe that their test results were reliable, but he couldn't convince himself. And that's a very good thing for the physician to have because he's had a lot more experience with these cases than the designers of those tests. Like fear, confidence and trust are affective states that respond to experience, that calibrate to experience. We learn what to fear, we learn what to trust through experience. That's different, again, from having a judgment that something is dangerous or reliable or trustworthy. The nervous flyer has a judgment that flying is safe. That's not the same thing as fully believing that flying is safe. Confidence and trust take a variety of objects. They transfer reliance from one to another. So you can have confidence in a person, you can trust a person, you can have confidence in your eyes, you can trust your eyes, you can have confidence in a process like a scientific method, and then that can transfer and will transfer through affective transfer to the conclusions or the outcomes, the propositions, for example, that might come out of the believer or the method. And so they have that feature. They also have the feature that they are intentional. The lost camper can believe that the lost camper is near the stream, but not believe that of himself. He can also be said to be confident of the map and confident of its location about the lost camper, but not confident of his own location because he isn't confident that that representation applies to himself. You get the idea that there are two different kinds of strength of belief from this picture. It's a compound model. There is a degree of confidence in a representation, and there is a degree of expectation of prediction and focused reliance on the object. And so the die that you've rolled many times that you're very confident of, you have a confident representation that the probability is going to be 1/6. That regulates a 1/6 expectation of an outcome. So being confident of the die is not the same thing as being confident of the particular outcome. And so you get these two different kinds of strength of belief, and you can see how they would have exactly the effect you'd expect. This one, the degree of reliance and expectation, that would reflect your betting odds, how much you should bet, what ratio you should bet at. But your confidence, your degree of trust in your representation of the situation should affect how much you'll put at stake. Okay? Like belief, confidence, and trust have this default inertial projective character. In developmental psychology, confidence and trust play a fundamental role in infant development. If infants are in situations where they can't form a confident or a trusting representation or relation with their environment or the people around them, this is very debilitating for learning. So confidence and trust play this kind of a fundamental role. And aroused affective attitudes like fear and surprise have got a very active phenomenology, but default affective attitudes like confidence and trust, which most of us fortunately get through our lives, those have a business as usual function, and so those kinds of affective states don't have a distracting phenomenology. Affect, while it's associated with feelings, much of it is indeed non-conscious or implicit, and so in that sense you can respond effectively to a situation without being aware of what your affect is in that situation, just as with belief. Okay, well, a good theory of something should be a good theory of the ways it can go wrong as well. It should help you understand them. So let's think about that nervous flyer. This nervous flyer has a high degree of confidence in a representation that flying is safe. So what goes wrong? Why is the nervous flyer clutching the armrests and sweating and expecting a crash at any minute? And the way phobia tends to operate, what's understood about it, is that it operates on this system, on the immediate stimulus-driven expectations that you have in a situation. Something may have happened to that person, so that the immediate stimulus produces this kind of an expectancy, even without the help of, indeed not regulated by, the higher order representation of the safety of the situation. That helps us understand this kind of inability to regulate your expectations by your confident belief, because the systems can be operated upon separately. Wishful thinking makes sense. Confidence is a form of positive affect. Trust is a form of positive affect. You can be lulled into all kinds of beliefs. In fact, we typically are lulled into many kinds of beliefs because of the capacity of positive affective transfer from something that we like, something that we have some kind of admiration for, to the idea that we trust it or count on it or that we accept it. And so because belief is an accepting state, and because these other states are accepting states, liking something, admiring something, we are quite guilty of the ability to transfer positive affect into belief even without good evidence. And finally, affective disorders like depression and mania and anxiety and so on, they have a systematic effect disrupting this system. In depression, you have a very serious deficit of positive affect. It makes it difficult to be confident. Depressed people not only have trouble having positive beliefs about the future, but they have trouble forming new beliefs. They have trouble with having the basic operation of confidence necessary for action to underwrite their behavior. So a deficit of capacity for positive affect undermines belief. Manic individuals, the opposite. They have a surplus of positive affect. They tend to believe too much what they think. They tend to rely on what they think without much evidence. A surplus of positive affect can make one dangerous to oneself in a different way from a deficit of it. So if we think of those as disorders of affect, they also understandably are disorders of belief as well. Okay, well, let me now pull things together a bit. So I'm claiming that owing to their parallel structure and owing to the common pathways through affect and expectation and the eliciting and focusing of action tendencies, that belief and desire on this compound model can actually satisfy Stalnaker's characterization. They can give you the dispositions which are such that you'll be in a situation in which you can act in light of what you believe on behalf of what you desire to bring it about that you satisfy your desire under the conditions in which you're operating. So they have that kind of a dispositional structure, and they have that kind of a regulative character, and they can do it, again, without intervention. So here they are, side by side, or one above the other. And so you can actually, this is silly because these are just I just draw these diagrams. But you can see what's perhaps going on here. What do we need in order to do sensible decision theory? We need decision weights. We need degrees of confidence and degrees of preference in order for us to be able to come to a conclusion about which desires are more important in a given situation, which beliefs are stronger. We need to have not a 0 or a 1, but we need to have a magnitude which we can use to get a decision weight and to multiply out so that we can actually compute expected value. And as we saw, animals do compute expected value. These are predictive expectations. In each case, in the case of belief and desire, there are things we expect to happen of our actions, and in that sense, they all have this projective character. They all have this character of giving us the capacity to find in experience a test of what we think and believe. And finally, they both lead to focused action tendencies. On the one hand, supplying motivation, focused on aspects of the object or event. On the other hand, supplying reliance, willingness to depend upon features of the situation in acting on behalf of that motivation. And so in that sense, then, running in parallel, they don't get in each other's way, and they can work together. They can share the space of the affective system in order to yield unified action tendencies as a result. Okay, well, we're going to talk more about action in the next lecture, so I don't want to push this too far here. But the thought is that these underlying intelligent dispositions give us ways of modeling the kind of intelligent, skilled behavior you see in individuals in ways that can be adaptive and that don't depend upon higher order cognition, that enables us to understand intelligent animals as well as intelligent humans. I just want to insert a couple of thoughts here. You can also design an artificial system. In fact, they're designing artificial systems right now that learn. They form expectations. They have representations of this world. We're pretty happy these days to talk about computers having representations and expectations. They can notice discrepancies between the expectations that they form. They can have the equivalent of measurements of uncertainty. They can have the equivalent of measurements of action tendency. So, do they have beliefs? Do they have desires? They have the functional stuff that you could put together to get beliefs and desires. But do they really have beliefs and desires? So I'll leave you with this question in your mind. Do they desire? Do they believe? What might they be missing? What might be holding us back from thinking that? And one answer would be affect. They don't trust. They don't have confidence. They aren't disappointed. They don't have surprise. Not yet, anyhow. I'm not saying this is impossible. They're probably quite possible because we're built out of stuff, too. They don't have frustration. They don't have longing. They don't have pining. So what they lack is not the intelligent infrastructure as such, but they lack the way in which it's accomplished via an affective system, which is characteristic of humans and which gives human life a kind of interest and a kind of moral concern that artificial life doesn't yet, at any rate, seem to have. Both belief and desire have a narrative to them, and they can make sense and not just function well. Okay, well, that's just a side thought. Now let's go back to the big issues. Recall what differentiated belief from supposition or imagining. Not that the one or the other represented their content as true. They all do that. Not the possibility of being called true or false. These weren't what did it. Remember, what did it was this idea of a strengthened notion of direction of fit, that was actually doing some work in explaining the dynamics of the state, the way it spontaneously responds to evidence, the way it spontaneously guides thought, feeling, and action, the non-voluntary character, the resistance that it has to instrumentalization. These are the key ways in which belief differs from these other states. And they're ways in which belief has a distinguished role in our mental economy. So let's go back to that diagram that we had of mind-to-world fitness. We can see, as we saw in the case of desire, that desire can have directedness, can have accuracy, proportionality. It can constitute an appreciation of a good. It can represent, in some sense, an understanding of the good. The richness of the desire system is, so far as I know, without limit in this respect. But you might say, well, but look, desires don't get truth. And that's the thing that we really need for rationality. But now let's have a thought about belief. Insofar as we think of belief as something that comes in degrees, it doesn't, strictly speaking, have truth or falsity. Belief is an attitude with a magnitude. Now, it has an object that can be true or false, but if I have a 0.9 expectation of rain tomorrow, confident 0.9 expectation of rain tomorrow, and it rains, am I right? Was that true? Well, it's consistent with 0.9. If I had a 0.1 expectation, it would also be consistent for it to rain tomorrow. Well, what's the sense in which it's better if it rains for me to have had 0.9 than 0.1? The answer is not truth, but what statisticians call accuracy, or what we might also think of as proportionality. Similarly, belief can have directedness. The same thought can be misdirected, as we saw in the case of a camper, and that's a failure of mind-to-world direction to fit. So, focusing on truth doesn't pry belief apart from supposition pretense. It doesn't capture these dynamic roles that we were talking about, and it may not capture the core of what makes beliefs rational when they're rational, which is to say they're well-directed, they're accurate, they're proportional to the evidence, they represent an appreciation of your epistemic situation, and they constitute some kind of an understanding of your epistemic situation. So that's the sense in which I want to say that belief and desire can both be fitting attitudes. We talked last time about belief of desire as a fitting attitude. Why? Because it has an evaluative representation, but it isn't just an empty evaluative representation. It takes the value seriously enough to be motivated to bring it about. So that's the sense in which it has both the appreciative and the motivational force of value which we would need. Well, similarly, in the case of belief, belief has both the appreciative character of understanding the degree of warranted or unwarranted evidence in the representation, but it also is treating the thing as real. When you rely upon it, you treat it as real. When you spontaneously rely upon it, you treat it as real. So in that sense, belief is a fitting attitude in response to evidence and reality. Okay, well, that's another way of trying to make this claim, that what really makes the interesting part of belief is that it is a fitting attitude to evidence and reality, and that is explained not primarily through the notion of truth, which again would work for other states. So here's the picture we get. Remember I said I was going to try to deepen belief and desire. Belief and desire are both representational. They both have an affective and an action guiding component. They both have mind to world, direction of fit. They both have a form of accuracy of expectation built into them. They both have a representation that regulates the behavior of the individual, permits learning from discrepancy. And these are all conditions which I think constitute forms of conditions for rationality. It could make our action potentially rational. So, is this Hume 2.0? It might be Hume 1.0. So, in the middle of this whole project, in which I was busy trying to defeat the Humean idea that belief's an inert representation and so on, I started reading the treatise. And I noticed that, again, a shameless appeal to authority, in the treatise, Hume writes, belief is more properly an act of the sensitive than of the cogitative part of our natures. Indeed, he considers this one of his most important discoveries, and it's essential to his criticism of rationalism. The rationalists don't even get belief. He writes, this is in the appendix, which he's trying to say, look, here's what you should pay attention to in the treatise. It's evident that belief consists not in the nature or order of our ideas, but in the manner of their conception and in their feeling to the mind. In philosophy, we can go no further than to assert that belief is something felt by the mind, which distinguishes the ideas of judgment from the fictions of the imagination. That's the difference with pretense. It gives them more force and influence. That's the business of having the action-guiding character, makes them appear of greater importance and fixes them in the mind, makes them objects of what he calls the firm attitude, and renders them the governing principles of all our actions. That's what the affective state of belief is doing. Moreover, when an object produces any passion in us, he tells us, this varies according to the different quantity of the object. The passions are responsive to the magnitudes of the world that they confront, so that when belief encounters varied relative frequencies in the environment, he writes, belief is broke into pieces and diffuses itself over the various patterns that we observe in proportion to the frequency of those we encounter and experience. And he writes, probability is of two kinds. Either when the object is really in itself uncertain, that's likely 1/6 probability on the die, to be determined by chance, or when, though the object is already certain, yet 'tis uncertain of our judgment, which finds evidence on both sides. That's the confidence. So he has the same dual picture of degrees of belief, the same picture that belief, like other affective attitudes, like other passions, learns from experience, and he allows, moreover, that this all has normative interest. These experience-based probabilities he calls philosophical probabilities, and he actually thinks philosophical is a nice thing in that context. He says they are received by the philosophers. He's proud of this. They are allowed to be reasonable foundations of belief and opinion. And he writes, "'Tis certain that a man of solid sense and long experience ought to have, and usually has, greater assurance in his opinions than one who is foolish and ignorant, and that our sentiments have different degrees of authority, even with ourselves, in proportion to the degrees of our reason and experience." So here's this idea, then, of sentiments having normative authority for you, thanks to the role that experience plays in them. So he devoted much of the appendix to the treatise and the abstract to explaining to the audience that his view about belief was central. It was an important discovery. He says, I agree, it's a little surprising to think of belief as a feeling. He expects it not to be widely understood. He expects that its importance is not going to be grasped. And when he wrote the abstract trying to promote the treatise, he tried to signal this fact to the readers. And so he concludes there. We are led, he says, by a chain of propositions which admit of no doubt to this effective count of belief. On the other hand, he didn't trust us to get it. He thought we wouldn't get it. And he wasn't wrong about that either. Thanks.